This woman, whose name I still didn't know, was a first-class thinker. "I have to ask you something," I said. "What is your name?" She blushed. "Well, I'm a Buffalo Rose. I guess I never properly introduced myself." "Rose, I'm Phil Wisdom," I said with a smile. "But what should I call you?" she said, suddenly flustered. "Dr. Wisdom?" "Look, you aren't a student of mine, so we can be more informal. How about just plain Phil?" I said. "No, I couldn't do that," she smiled coyly. "How about Dr. Phil?" "You're kind of a therapist for my thoughts." She grinned at her pun. "Okay, have it your way. Dr. Phil I am. And I'd like to just be Rose for now. I really don't know about giving my last name to you yet." I was puzzled at that, but I let it pass for the present. That's the answer to that is in a part of the dialogue I haven't written yet. So. It's interesting that you've identified that problem, I said. The Greek philosophers called it the paradox of the heap. Heap? Heap of what? She said, puzzled. Of sand, I said, or maybe of acorns. She thought for a minute and then brightened. I get it. A grain of sand isn't a heap. Add another grain, you still don't have a heap. Continue adding grains. At some point, we would clearly say there is a heap of sand, yet we got there through incremental additions of grains, no one of which seems sufficient to tip us over from a non-heap to a heap. The same is true of the changes in pre-humans that preceded and led to the first human. She paused and then said, "But that's not all that bothers me about evolution. It's unfair to suppose that all humans have souls, but no pre-human ancestor has a soul. Souls are what are supposed to survive our bodies' deaths, to have eternal life. Why should an almost human not have eternal life if she gave rise to children that did? She's the mother of the human race." "Why indeed," I said, smiling inwardly. She looked sad again and searched my face. "I've learned recently that chimpanzees are like humans, so like humans they have something like 98.5% of their genes in common with us. They are 98.5% human. It's unfair for them not to have souls, if we do. They are like our relatives. Their not having souls and our having them is so arbitrary." "Well," I said, "perhaps they do have souls." "But," she protested, "why stop with chimps? There's heaps of genes everywhere, and lots of those heaps have many genes in common with other heaps. Maybe chimps differ just a bit from orangs, and orangs from macaques, and so on. I can't believe that evolution produced us, and also that only we have souls. Besides, all these other animals get through gestation without souls just fine. I don't think that humans need them either." "That is a pretty startling conclusion, if I may say so," I said. "It has startled me and worried me too," she said. "I feel like without the soul, anything goes." "What do you mean?" She said, "If there is no soul, why wouldn't abortion be okay at any point, right up to birth? For that matter, what would be wrong with killing a baby or a child or a teenager just because they misbehave? Without a soul, a human is just another animal." Her distress was evident. I decided to jump back in the discussion more forcefully. "Actually, without souls, killing of other humans is even worse than with souls." "How so?" she quavered. "Because it ends a life underway. With no eternal life, killing is annihilation of the individual. People that are killed are no longer just without their live bodies, they are no longer at all. Their lives, their identities have been cut short, snuffed out. And we value our lives, even our lives when they have much pain and suffering. Our valuing life is what gives it great value. So depriving someone of the life he values, of all the possibilities of learning and loving, of making amends and reforming, of creating life plans and striving to realize them, is awful to contemplate." But she almost wailed, "Then my position that abortion is murder must be correct. After 16 days, when you have an individual life that started, aborting the pregnancy and denying that life its chance to do all those things we value is terrible. It's worse than capital punishment, because the baby has done nothing to merit being punished." Her face was a mix of confusion and anger. I said, "Well, think back on our first conversation. Most fertilized eggs don't make it to a normal birth. Why are we not very distressed over the fertilized ova that don't implant but pass out of women's bodies? Why are we not as distressed at the death of an embryo or fetus due to a spontaneous abortion as we are at the death of a teenager? The church doesn't provide those embryos and fetuses with last rites, let alone the unwanted pre-embryos that have been created in petri dishes in the course of treating infertility. She stared at me, trying to comprehend the point. It must be because God never intended those spontaneously aborted pregnancies to come to term, so those lives' potentials haven't been frustrated. Those potentials never existed. Well, I said, that leaves the why of such carnage completely mysterious. Why would God allow 2/3 or more of the fertilized ova end in not becoming implanted, or becoming spontaneously aborted, or in being stillborn? I could see her beginning to regress, not surprising in the light of the pressure of these new ideas. God moves in mysterious ways, she said almost as a question. Well, perhaps. Perhaps we simply can't comprehend the divine reasons for what happens. But my point was, whether we understand or not, we in fact don't count as great a tragedy the loss of a fetus as the loss of a teenager. She tried to pull herself in the conversation back to her original set of questions. So why don't we, if fetuses and teenagers both have souls? I said, well, there may be a different way of thinking about these things besides in terms of souls. That's what I thought, she said, shaking off her mood a moment ago. You don't believe in souls at all. What I believe or don't believe is not at issue here. What we're trying to do together, as we were trying to do a month ago, is to understand better both the conservative view and possible alternatives to it. I paused, and then I went on. Let's consider the differences in a teenager and a fetus. Up until about the 6th month of a pregnancy, the fetus is not capable of any kind of perception. Before then, there are no sensory organs yet developed. Moreover, the thalamus, a kind of neurological relay station in the brain for incoming sensory information to the cortex, is not yet formed. And the neocortex, the locus of perceptual experiences of various sorts, hasn't begun to function. Rose said, that sounds about right from my biology textbook, but how do we know these things? The onset of the function of sensory organs has been studied by means of the phenomenon of habituation. Studies have shown that by 23 weeks of gestation, fetuses respond with a slowing of the heart rate during maternal speech, a demonstration of habituation that in turn implies learning dependent on memory of the repetitive input. Fetuses seem able to differentiate between the sounds of different persons' speech and also show preference for their mother's native language. Wow, she said, that's really interesting evidence. I said, that's not all. Experimenters have fed different sorts of food to pregnant women. Their fetuses were therefore exposed to those food characteristics in the amniotic fluid. After birth, newborns so exposed were tested to their reaction to the taste of a range of foods, including both the ones previously fed to the mothers and to others that had not been fed to them. The fetuses were found to have developed a preference for the foods to which they had been exposed in utero. So a fetus stores a reception of the specific food tastes and smells, and this information is available after birth to influence the preferences of the child. Rose said, well, what about other evidence? Well, fetuses' heart rates increase when they are exposed to musical sounds to which they've not been previously exposed. But if they're exposed to those sounds repeatedly, the heart rate eventually returns to the baseline. This response is carried over to music to which babies are exposed after birth. This phenomenon has been observed especially in regard to theme music of the popular television programs that mothers regularly watch during the last 3 months of pregnancy. I stopped to organize the points I thought followed from this, but Rose had already anticipated them.